Hello, teachers of Assessment for Learning Google Classroom. I'm really excited about this first lesson, and I want it to be quick and easy for you because I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to just jump right into this. This week we are talking about learning objectives and the power of learning objectives and integrating into our classrooms so that students can actually use them. All too often we put them on the board just to check off a list of something that we have to do as a teacher, but we fail to find the power in learning objectives. So we're going to start looking right into this. Our objective over this next several weeks is going to be focusing on formulating learning objectives and specific success criteria in the form of rubrics that can be used by students to evaluate quality of their own and others' work. So in that, you see that students are beginning to take ownership of their own work and using those learning objectives themselves to evaluate their own work. Now in this lesson, we're not going to talk about rubrics yet. I wanted to focus just on learning objectives first so that we make sure we have quality learning objectives for our students and then move into rubrics. So a lot of the things that we talk about also apply for rubrics, but right now we're just going to apply it for learning objectives. So more specifically in this lesson, we're going to do two things. We're going to learn how to modify the wording of our learning objectives to improve student comprehension of the learning objectives, because we want students to be able to read them and know, okay, this is what I need to do to be successful. And then we're going to learn how to integrate the learning objectives in the beginning, middle, and end of your lesson, rather than just at the beginning where we say, okay, this is what we're going to do, guys, and then never go back to it. We want to continue to return to that learning objective throughout the lesson. So I'm going to give you a lot of practical tips and strategies that you can use in your classroom immediately. So let's go right into it. First, we're going to talk about writing the learning objectives. So first thing I want to talk about is changing your learning objectives into the first person statements. We want to imply to our students that it is theirs, it is something that they need to do rather than something the teacher is trying to accomplish. It is their job to accomplish this learning objective. So here we have a learning objective that I pulled from our TEKS. Students will be able students, that's a typo, students will be able to add and subtract whole numbers and decimals to the hundredths place using the standard algorithm. Now, that's a really difficult learning standard to get across. So we're going to talk about later on how to make sure students understand this. But simply what I want you to do here is just change the wording a little bit and say, I will know I have learned this when I can add and subtract whole numbers and decimals to the hundredths place using the standard algorithm. This already gives the student the implication that, okay, now this is mine. I know I will have learned it when I can add and subtract. So it puts it in that frame. I'm responsible for knowing when I've learned this objective, and I'm responsible for the one who's able to do it. It's not the teacher's job to teach me, it's my job to learn it. So that's a really simple thing we can change when we're talking about learning objectives and writing them and expressing them to our students. So let's talk a little bit about using student-friendly language. I know there's a lot of debate about whether we should use it or not. I have my own opinion, but I just want to present both sides and you decide. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. But the pros of using student-friendly language, obviously, are students may have a clear understanding of what they should be learning because they're using words that are more understandable to them. The con is we are removing a lot of the academic language necessary for students to understand and use. So a lot of that academic language that we're going to pull out are words really they need to know, and we're going to lose some of the meaning of the learning objective. So we have an example here, and the first example down here to the left, describe explicit and implicit relationships among ideas in text organized by sequence. Now that's a really complex learning objective that we need our students to understand. So what we could do is change it where we say to the right here, bottom right, describe connections among ideas that are obvious and not obvious in text in first, second, third order. Now we still have a lot of the same concepts within that learning objective, but we have lost a little bit of the meaning. Explicit and implicit don't exactly mean obvious and not obvious, so that's not exactly what we're trying to do in the learning objective. And we've pulled out the word sequence, which is really an important word for our students to understand, to know what sequencing is in a text that is sequenced in first, second, third order. So there's the pros and cons. I'm not going to say either way you should use student-friendly language, but one thing you want to take consideration, especially for our younger students, it may be necessary to change those learning standards to student-friendly language for our K1, 2, maybe even third. So take that into consideration, also the age of your students. So let's talk about breaking learning targets down into success criteria. So it's very hard sometimes for a student to look at that learning objective and say, oh, now I know what to do. Because if they know what to do, then why are we teaching it? Because they already know it. So we really need to break it down so that they see the individual parts of that learning objective. And this, again, this is going to lead into rubrics later on, because what rubrics really do is take a learning objective and divide it up into different parts for students to look at the different sections of that rubric. So in this particular learning objective, develop drafts by categorizing ideas and organizing them into paragraphs. So what I did is I just broke that into parts, really to develop drafts and to categorize the ideas and organizing it into paragraphs. They need to do these following things to the right. They need to have, in this particular lesson, have 3 coherent ideas that are included in the paper. All the ideas flow naturally and seamlessly from paragraph to paragraph. Each paragraph has one main idea with logical supporting sentences, and all ideas work together to support the overall argument of the paper. Now the students can individually look, have I included 3 coherent ideas? Do all my ideas flow naturally from paragraph to paragraph? And if they can do each one individually, then they know all those things work together to successfully meet the overall learning objective. So I want you to think about that as well when we start moving into rubrics, because that's going to be a big part of it. That's one way to do it really for the English side and the reading side. I know math, sometimes they struggle with this, so one great way to do this in math is not to do it in divisible parts, but to put it down into a progression. So a lot of times math is a process, something that the students have to know. And we really want our students to focus more on the process than getting the answer. Because if they know the process, then they can transfer that ability into other math outside of the classroom. So in this particular example, add and subtract whole numbers in decimals to the hundredths place using the standard algorithm. That's a really in-depth and really complex learning objective. So what we can do is break that down into parts. To do that, first we need to identify the operation, line up the decimals vertically, and again, I'm not a math person, so forgive me if I'm missing something. Add and subtract starting from the smallest place value to the right. Continue to add or subtract moving to the left, and remember to regroup when appropriate. As a student, I can go through those steps and make sure that I'm doing each one correctly in order to reach and to meet this learning objective. So the last thing to kind of bring all those things together is something called Walt and Wilf. So the Walt is pretty much your learning objective. We are learning to, and then the objective is stated, but to help our students understand again what that objective looks like, we use the Wilf, what I'm looking for. And so the students know the Walt is my learning objective and the Wilf is the part that I need to look at as a student. This is what I need to do in order to meet that learning objective. So I'm not going to read through all that. You can if you want to pause it and read through it to get that idea, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory there. So let's move into integrating the learning objectives in the beginning, middle, and end of your lesson, because we don't want to just do it at the beginning and forget about them. The first thing before you can do any of this, and this kind of goes without saying, I think everyone knows this, but none of this is going to work unless your learning objective, your instructional activities, and your assessments all align. If your learning objective is one thing, but your instructional activities are doing something else, it's going to be very confusing to your students. The instructional activities need to somehow embody whether or not they can meet the learning objective. If those things don't align, and same thing with the assessment, then we really have another issue that we need to talk about. So first, let's talk about how we can get students to ask clarifying questions. So one strategy is first to give students a copy of the learning objectives and a success criteria. Here they begin to read over it and start to think about it on their own. Then they get into groups and they talk and write down their questions about the learning objectives, that some things that they may not understand, like vocabulary words or certain concepts, or maybe they just don't understand it because it's so complex, and they talk about those questions among their partner groups. Then they try to resolve the questions with their peers. So you may have 2 groups of 2, they come together with their questions and they help each other figure out the questions that they've posed about the learning objective and see if the students themselves can help each other figure out what this learning objective is trying to get across. And then lastly, as a teacher, you collect the final list of questions and you discuss them as a whole group. This is going to give you a lot of good information as a teacher because then you'll see where the gaps are as far as concepts and terms that you need to make sure you're honing in on, that the class as a whole is not understanding. And maybe they won't completely come to a grip of what that learning objective means there, but they'll be a whole lot closer than they would if they had just read it and moved on. And so they're a little bit closer to understanding what quality looks like. But you're not done. You can't just do this at the beginning of the lesson. You have to continue to come back to it. And that's what our second strategy kind of does. In this one, we're trying to get students to put the learning objectives in their own words. So just like the last strategy, you give the students the learning objectives, and then you have them try to explain in partner groups what the learning objectives mean. This time the students begin the assignment, and halfway through the assignment the students come back to their partners and they look at the quality of work that they've done so far and explain how what they are doing is meeting the criteria or is not meeting their criteria, and they use their partner to look at each other's work. And again, this is a high level on Bloom's. This is evaluating. The students now are looking at someone else's and their own work and evaluating, am I meeting the criteria? And again, this is going to be easier with rubrics, but right now we're focusing on learning objectives. So the students go back and finish their assignment, and then they redo it again at the end. They come back in partners and discuss, did I meet the criteria or did I not meet the criteria? So the last strategy that I'm going to share is co-constructing learning objectives. And this is trying to get students, give them some ownership in creating their own learning objectives. And so one way you can do this is to identify the content knowledge first that the learning objective is addressing, and then give the students some sample work. And so they begin to look, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of this sample work. And then the students begin to categorize those strengths and weaknesses into different categories. And so at the end, you as a teacher go back and you discuss and try to put some of those strengths and weaknesses into learning objectives, kind of wordsmith, help them walk through that process of putting those into statements about what quality looks like within this particular assignment. This one I really like because then they're looking at actual sample assignments, and sometimes that's a lot easier for them to understand what quality is rather than just reading a very abstract statement and trying to come to a conclusion. So that's all the learning objectives I have in this particular video, but if you go to this website, goo.gl/HR N981, make sure you pay attention to the capital letters. You can go to another video I've made and skip forward to the 14 minutes and 35 seconds, and you will be able to see, I think, 4 or 5 more strategies that you can use in order to start getting learning objectives into your classroom and integrating them in so that students know where they're going. It's very important that students don't have blindfolds on, that they can see their path and they can see the light at the end of the tunnel and what quality looks like. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to continue to share some things over Google Classroom and you'll receive emails. Thank you so much again for joining this classroom, and I hope that you have learned something, and we will meet this Thursday. All right, thank you.